The air in Assessment Chamber 7 was a manufactured stillness, recycled and scrubbed of all organic impurities. It tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing. It was the color of absence. Elian sat on the edge of a diagnostic chair, its surface a cool, unsympathetic polymer against his skin. The tunic he wore was the same sterile white as the walls, the floor, the ceiling, a blank canvas upon which the consortium would paint its expectations. He focused on the hum, a low, persistent thrum from the environmental controls that vibrated just at the edge of hearing. It was a sound that had underlined every moment of his 24 years, a sonic cage he had only recently learned to recognize. A faint tremor began in his hands, a subtle rebellion of nerve endings against the mandated calm. He pressed his palms flat against his thighs, trapping the motion. Control. Everything was about control. Beyond the one-way chroma glass that formed the chamber's fourth wall, he knew two figures watched. One was a facilitator, a beta whose job was to record, to analyze, to reduce his biological responses to a string of alphanumeric code. The other was Director Kale. He did not need to see Kale to feel his presence. It was a pressure change in the sterile air, a sharpening of the silence. Kale's observation was not passive. It was an act of dissection. He was the architect of this system of quiet, clinical pairings, the man who ensured genetic legacy continued with the precision of a chronometer. And he was the reason Elian was still here, still unpaired, an anomaly in a system that abhorred them. The door slid open with a sigh of pneumatics, and the candidate entered. Alpha Lyran, genetically perfect, the datapad had informed him. His profile read like a blueprint for the consortium's future. High-yield intellect, stable temperament, zero recessive genetic markers. He was handsome in the way a statue is handsome, all clean lines and calculated symmetry. His scent, carefully modulated by his own suppressants, was a faint, pleasant whisper of citrus and clean linen. It was designed to be inoffensive, to soothe, to signal compliance. It did nothing for Elian. It was just another layer of the sterile nothingness. Subject Elian, Lyran said. His voice was a perfectly tuned baritone, the kind they engineered for public announcements. He did not use Elian's name as a name, but as a designation. It is a privilege to be considered for this pairing. Elian inclined his head, the motion stiff. Alpha Lyran. They sat in silence for a moment, a tableau of genetic potential. The consortium did not encourage idle conversation. The connection, they believed, was purely biological, a matter of pheromonal compatibility that could be measured and predicted. Words were messy, imprecise, yet the silence stretched, thin and brittle. Lyran's gaze swept over him, analytical, assessing his features, his posture. Elian felt less like a person and more like a specimen under a microscope, pinned and labeled. He resisted the urge to shift, to cross his arms, to do anything that might be logged as defensive posturing or emotional instability. His own scent, what little escaped his daily suppressant dose, was meant to be dormant. But in the presence of an unfamiliar alpha, a faint, nervous trace of something earthy and wild, petrichor and aging paper, the scent of the archives where he worked, threatened to bloom. He fought it down, a silent, internal war. Your work in the historical archives is noted as unusual, Lyran commented, breaking the protocol of silence. It was a test, Elian knew, a way to gauge his reaction to a deviation from the script. A focus on pre-consortium artifacts seems counterproductive to forward momentum ideologies. History provides context, Elian replied, his voice a low monotone. Without it, we cannot measure progress. It was the approved answer, the one he'd rehearsed. Lyran nodded, a small, satisfied motion. A logical assessment. Behind the glass, Kyle would be watching. He would see the way Elian's fingers were clenched just out of Lyran's sight. He would see the minute tightening of the muscles around his eyes. Kyle saw everything, and for some reason, he always found a flaw. The last candidate had been dismissed for a barely perceptible asymmetry in his gait. The one before that, for a vocal inflection that suggested a predisposition to sentimentality. Kyle's reasons were always clinical, always irrefutable, and always, Elian suspected, a fabrication. A soft chime echoed through the chamber. The first phase of the assessment was complete. The next would involve a controlled release of pheromones, a biological conversation stripped of all nuance. The air recyclers shifted pitch, preparing to introduce Lyran's unmuffled scent into the chamber. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, coiled in Elian's stomach. This was the moment of truth, the point where his body was supposed to react with the docile acceptance of a well-bred Omega. His body was supposed to signal readiness, compatibility. It never did. Not really. It remained a fortress of tightly controlled neutrality, and the facilitators always noted it as a point of concern. But before the scent could be introduced, a red light pulsed on the wall panel. The chime sounded again, this time a harsh, discordant note of interruption. The voice of the facilitator, filtered through a speaker, was flat and metallic. Assessment terminated. Alpha Lyran, your presence is no longer required. Lyran's perfect composure fractured for a nanosecond. Confusion flickered in his eyes before being ruthlessly suppressed. He stood, smoothed his tunic, and gave Elian a curt nod. Subject Elian. He turned and exited as smoothly as he had entered. The door sighed shut, leaving Elian alone once more in the humming silence. He waited. He knew what came next. The pressure in Urshel. The room shifted again, the invisible weight of Kyle's attention intensifying before the door to the observation room opened. Director Kale stepped into the chamber. He was not built like a statue. He was built like a weapon. Tall, lean, all sharp angles, and contained power. His uniform was the severe black of the directorate, a stark contrast to the sterile white of the room. His face was a mask of cold authority, but his eyes, a startling pale grey, the colour of a winter sky, missed nothing. His scent was always the same, a clean, biting aroma of ozone and cold steel, the smell of absolute, uncompromising control. It should have been intimidating. It was, but beneath the intimidation, it stirred something else in Elian, something deep and dormant that terrified him. Director, Elian said, his voice quiet. Kale didn't look at him immediately. He walked to the wall panel, his boots making no sound on the polished floor. He scanned the data readout, his expression unreadable. Lyran's biometric readings showed a latent adrenal variance of 0.02%, an indicator of suppressed aggression, unacceptable for a primary pairing. Elian said nothing. 0.02%. It was a meaningless number, a statistical ghost. It was an excuse. He was not an asset being protected. He was a possession being hoarded. The thought was dangerous, a spark of heresy in the sanctum of his mind. You are to be commended on your composure, Elian, Kyle continued, his back still to him. The use of his name, not his designation, was a calculated intimacy, a subtle claim. Your pheromonal output remained within baseline parameters. Stable, numb, dead. The words were synonymous. Elian stared at Kale's rigid back, at the sharp line of his shoulders. A bitter, unfamiliar anger began to uncoil within him. Why? Why did he do this? This charade of protection, this elaborate dance of control. Kale was the ultimate enforcer of the system, yet he subverted it at every turn when it came to Elian. He was a walking contradiction, a paradox of ironclad rules and secret betrayals. Kale finally turned, his grey eyes pinning Elian to the chair. The air crackled with the unspoken things between them. His gaze was heavy, possessive. It stripped away the sterile white of the room and left Elian feeling utterly exposed. "I don't do relationships," Kyle had told him once, months ago, after the dismissal of the very first candidate. The words had been delivered with the cold finality of a death sentence. The term itself, relationship, was an archaic one, associated with the messy, emotional bonds of the past. The consortium had pairings, procreative contracts, genetic alliances, not relationships. They are an inefficient, emotionally volatile construct, a liability. And yet, he stood there now, the silent, immovable guardian of Elian's solitude. He would not have him, but he would not let anyone else near him. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a tightening in Elian's chest that made the recycled air feel thin and sharp. He was a rare book in a collector's library, locked behind glass, never to be opened, but jealously guarded. The tremor returned to his hands, stronger this time. He didn't try to hide it. Let him see. Let the director of order see the chaos he was creating. Kale's eyes flickered down to Elian's trembling fingers, and for a fleeting instant, something shifted in their depths. A flicker of something that was not control, not authority, something far more dangerous. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind the cold steel of his gaze. "The assessment is concluded," Kale stated, his voice returning to its default, detached tone. "Return to your duties at the archives. I will adjust your security detail personally." It was not a suggestion. It was a declaration. He was tightening the leash, drawing the walls of the cage closer. Elian rose from the chair, his movement stiff. He walked toward the door, his entire body thrumming with a silent, desperate scream. As he passed Kale, the director's scent, that sharp, sterile ozone, washed over him. But this time, it was different. Beneath the cold precision, there was a ghost of something else, something dark and possessive, a low growl of thunder hidden deep within a winter storm. It was the scent of a predator, and it wrapped around Elian, an invisible, indelible mark. He did not do relationships. He only did ownership, and Elian, for the first time, felt the true weight of the chains he could not see. The door slid open, offering an escape back into the regulated world, but Elian knew he wasn't leaving the cage. He was just moving into a slightly larger one with Kale holding the key. The archives of historical artifacts was Elian's sanctuary and his prison. It was a place of regulated silence, deeper and more resonant than the humming stillness of the assessment chambers. Here, the air carried the ghost of other times, the faint, organic sense of decaying paper, oxidized metal, and dried pigments, all carefully contained within climate-controlled stasis fields. It was the only place in the enclave where the past was permitted to exist, albeit as a catalogued and neutralized curiosity. Elian's work was to maintain these artifacts, to ensure their slow, managed decay did not accelerate, and to digitize their contents for the central database. It was a task deemed suitable for an Omega of his temperament, quiet, meticulous, and isolated. After the terminated assessment, the quiet of the archives felt different. It felt charged. Kale's parting words, "I will adjust your security detail personally," had manifested as Kale himself. He now occupied the small observation office that overlooked the main archival floor, a glass-walled box from which he could survey Elian's every move. He claimed it was a matter of efficiency and direct oversight, citing the ongoing security risk posed by Elian's unique genetic value. It was, like all of Kale's explanations, a masterpiece of clinical logic that concealed a deeply illogical truth. He was watching him, constantly. Elian sat at his workstation, a smooth white console surrounded by holographic displays. He was meant to be transcribing the fragmented text of a pre-consortium paper book, its pages brittle as autumn leaves. The book smelled of dust and time. He ran a gloved finger over the faded ink, the elegant, inefficient curves of handwritten script. It was a poem, something about the sea, a concept he only understood through sensory simulations. The words spoke of salt spray and endless blue, of a raw, untamable freedom. As he worked, he could feel Kyle's gaze on his back, a persistent physical pressure. He tried to lose himself in the loops and swirls of the forgotten alphabet, but the director's presence was a magnetic field, warping the space around him. The chime of his console broke his concentration. A new work order, dispatched from the director's office, his own office 10 feet away. The message was concise. Report to Sub-Level Gamma. Crate 7B requires immediate analysis. It is a high-priority acquisition. Sub-Level Gamma was a quarantine zone reserved for newly recovered artifacts that hadn't yet been fully sanitized of potential organic contaminants from the outside wastes. Access was highly restricted. Elian sent back a query, his fingers moving stiffly over the console. Protocol requires a 2-person team for gamma-level analysis. My assigned beta partner is on a different rotation. The reply was instantaneous. I will accompany you. The air in the lift that descended into the sub-levels was colder, heavier. Kyle stood beside him, not touching, but the proximity was overwhelming in the confined space. His clean, sharp scent filled the small car, displacing the neutral air, making Elian's lungs feel tight. He stared at his own reflection in the polished steel of the door, a pale, wavering figure in white. Kyle's dark form was a solid shadow behind him. In the reflection, their eyes met. Kyle's expression was unreadable, but his gaze held Elian's for a beat too long, an exchange of silent, charged intensity before Elian looked away, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sub-level Gamma was stark and utilitarian. The air hummed with the energy of high-powered sterilization fields. Crate 7B sat alone in the center of the room, a large, rust-streaked metal container. Kyle unlocked it with a palm scan, and the lid hissed open. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were objects unlike any Elian had ever handled. They were not books or tools. They were canvases stretched over wooden frames, covered in thick, vibrant swirls of color. Paintings. The system discouraged non-functional art. It was deemed a source of emotional volatility. These were raw, passionate, and utterly defiant. From a settlement in the outer zones, Kyle said, his voice low in the humming quiet. They were destroyed for harboring unsanctioned cultural materials. These were the only pieces recovered. Elian reached in, his gloved hands trembling slightly, and lifted the topmost canvas. It depicted a face, but it was fractured, rendered in jagged shapes and clashing colors, deep blues and violent reds. The eyes were wide with a silent scream. It was an image of pure, undiluted anguish. It was beautiful. He felt a strange resonance with the painting, a kinship with its trapped, screaming soul. He could feel the artist's pain, his rage, his despair, bleeding through the centuries. "What is your analysis?" Kale's voice was close, just behind his shoulder. Elian's breath hitched. He could feel the warmth radiating from Kyle's body. "The use of color is aggressive," he began, falling back on the clinical language he was trained to use. "The composition is asymmetrical, designed to evoke a sense of instability. The subject matter is indicative of significant psychological distress." "Is that all you see?" Kyle's voice was a low murmur, a current of energy that vibrated through the air. "Look closer, Elian." Elian stared at the painting, trying to see beyond the technical analysis. He saw the texture of the paint, the way it was layered, thick and desperate. He saw the ghost of a fingerprint near the edge, a human, imperfect mark. And he saw defiance. The artist had not just been in pain, they had been fighting it, documenting it, refusing to let it be silent. It was not a portrait of suffering. It was a portrait of survival. "It's alive," Elian whispered, the word feeling foreign and powerful on his tongue. A strange sound, almost a sigh, escaped Kyle. When he spoke again, his voice was different, stripped of its directorial authority, leaving something more raw and personal. "Yes, it is." Elian turned his head slightly, and his cheek almost brushed the black fabric of Kyle's uniform. The scent of ozone was sharp, but beneath it, for the first time, he caught that other note again, the dark, hidden thunder. It was stronger now, a low hum of possessiveness mingled with something else he couldn't name, longing. It was the scent of a carefully contained storm. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Kyle, the embodiment of control, was fighting a war within himself, and Elian was, somehow, at the center of it. He quickly turned back to the crate, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He reached for another canvas, his movements clumsy. "I will need to run a full spectral analysis to determine the age and composition of the pigments," he said, his voice strained. "Of course," Kyle replied, his tone once again cool and distant. The moment of intimacy, if that's what it had been, was over. The curtain of control drawn shut. But the memory of it lingered, a phantom warmth on Elian's skin, a crack in the sterile facade of their world. Kale had brought him here for a reason, not for an analysis of a crate, but for this, to show him this raw, forbidden beauty, to see if he would recognize it. It was another test, but not one the consortium would have designed. It was Kale's own, and Elian, looking at the screaming face on the canvas, felt with a terrifying certainty that he had passed. He also felt the walls of his carefully constructed world begin to crumble, because the director who was his jailer was also the only person who had ever shown him something truly alive. This paradox was more dangerous than any alpha candidate, more confining than any assessment chamber. It was a cage made of questions, and Kyle stood at its door, holding a key he refused to use. Days bled into a rhythmic pattern of tension and observation. Kyle remained a constant, silent presence in the glass office, his shadow falling across Elian's work. He never interfered, never spoke unless necessary, but his watchfulness was a weight on Elian's shoulders. The proximity was a slow form of torture. Elian's senses, long dulled by suppressants and routine, began to sharpen, honed by the constant awareness of the alpha nearby. He started to notice the subtle shifts in Kyle's scent, the way the ozone sharpened when a courier entered the archives, or the way the metallic note softened late at night when they were the only two left in the vast, silent repository. The consortium, however, was a machine that did not tolerate idle components. A new directive arrived, not on Elian's console, but on Kale's. Elian saw the message illuminate the director's datapad, saw the rigid set of his jaw as he read it. A new candidate had been selected, Alpha Jorik. His profile was even more formidable than Lyran's. Jorik was not from the administrative caste. He was from the security forces, a high-ranking officer known for his ambition and his unyielding adherence to protocol. He was a direct challenge to Kyle's authority, a move by the council to force the issue of Elian's pairing. The meeting was scheduled not in the sterile anonymity of an assessment chamber, but in the formal lounge of the Directorate building. A clear signal that this was not a preliminary assessment, but a final decision. The room was designed to impress, with a soaring ceiling and a vast window overlooking the geometric perfection of the city. But the grand scale only made Elian feel smaller, more trapped. He wore a formal silver-grey tunic, the fabric cool and heavy against his skin. Kale stood by the window, a sentinel in black, his back to the room. He had said nothing to Elian on the way here, the silence in the transport thick with an almost violent tension. Alpha Jorik arrived precisely on schedule. He was a physically imposing man, broad-shouldered and confident. His scent was strong, aggressive even through his modulators, a sharp, resinous odor like pine and scorched metal. It was a scent of dominance, designed to command and intimidate. It set every nerve in Elian's body on edge, a primal instinct, screaming threat. Director Kale, subject Elian, Jorik said, his voice a low growl that vibrated in Elian's bones. He nodded curtly at Kale, but his eyes were fixed on Elian, a bold, possessive gaze that stripped him bare. The council has expressed its impatience. They feel this matter has been delayed long enough. Kale turned slowly from the window. The air in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The council's impatience does not supersede established protocol, Commander. Kale's voice was ice. The subject's welfare and genetic security are paramount. Of course, Jorik said, a smirk playing on his lips. He took a step closer to Elian. And I am here to secure that asset, permanently. He deliberately invaded Elian's personal space, his powerful scent washing over him, a suffocating wave. Elian flinched, an involuntary retreat of his body that he couldn't suppress. He felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to flee. Jorik's smile widened. He saw the fear, and he savored it. The subject appears agitated, Jorik observed, his gaze still locked on Elian, but his words directed at Kale. Perhaps his isolation in the archives has made him delicate. Before Elian could process the insult, something in the room shifted. It was Kale. He hadn't moved a muscle, but the atmosphere around him had condensed, becoming heavy, dangerous. The clean, sterile scent of ozone and steel began to change. The coldness remained, but it was no longer the cold of a sterile chamber. It was the killing cold of deep space, and beneath it, the scent Elian had only caught in whispers before, the dark, possessive thunder, was unleashed. It wasn't a shout. It was a profound, absolute silence that swallowed all other sound. A wave of pure, unadulterated alpha dominance flooded the room, a scent that spoke not of command, but of annihilation. It was a promise of violence, delivered with chilling precision. Jorik faltered. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of shock and then primal fear. His own aggressive scent withered, soured by the overwhelming pressure of Kyle's. He took an unconscious step back from Elian, his body reacting instinctively to a predator far higher on the food chain than he had anticipated. The room was filled with Kyle's scent now. It wasn't just a warning. It was a claim. It saturated the air, clung to the walls, and settled over Elian like a shroud. It wrapped around him, a possessive, terrifying, and yet protective barrier. It said, without a single word, mine. Elian's panic receded, replaced by a stunned awe. His heart was still racing, but for a different reason. His own body responded to the raw display, a deep, shivering tremor running through him. The dormant Omega within him, so long suppressed and silenced, recognized the scent not as a threat, but as a shield. It was the scent of a mate defending his territory. Kale's grey eyes, hard as flint, were locked on Yorich. "Commander," he said, his voice lethally quiet, "your pheromonal output is showing signs of instability, a clear violation of assessment protocol. This meeting is over. You will be logged for disciplinary review." Yorick's face paled. He stared at Kale, then at Elian, who was now enveloped in the director's potent, possessive scent. He saw the truth of the situation in that moment. He had never been a candidate. He had been a test, a pawn in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. Without another word, he turned and strode from the room, his retreat a clear admission of defeat. The door closed, leaving Elian and Kale alone in the charged silence. Kyle's scent still saturated the air, a powerful, lingering statement. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths, reining in the phenomenal power he had just unleashed. The storm was being contained, locked back in its cage. Slowly, the scent of ozone and steel returned to its familiar, sterile neutrality. But the memory of its true nature now lay between them, an undeniable truth. Elian found his voice, a mere whisper. "You." He didn't know how to finish the sentence. "You claimed me. You marked me. You broke your own rules." Kyle finally moved, turning his head to look at Elian. His face was a pale, unreadable mask, but his eyes were dark with a turmoil that mirrored the storm in his scent. The control was back in place, but it seemed fragile now, a thin sheet of ice over a raging sea. "He was a threat," Kyle stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was an explanation that explained nothing. "You scented me," Elian said, the words tasting of rebellion. "In front of him. Everyone in this wing of the building will know. An Omega carrying the scent of a powerful, unbonded alpha was a scandal, a violation of the highest order. It was a necessary tactical response to an aggressive variable," Kale replied, the clinical jargon a pathetic shield against the enormity of what had just happened. "A tactical response," Elian repeated, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping him. He took a step toward Kale, fueled by a sudden, reckless courage. "You said you don't do relationships. You said they were a liability. What is this then? This guarding me, this chasing everyone away, this marking. What do you call this, Director?" He stood before Kale now, close enough to see the flicker of a muscle in his jaw, the profound darkness in his pupils. Kale looked down at him, and for a moment the mask of the Director slipped entirely. Elian saw a man who was haunted, a man who was trapped. The cold steel in his gaze was replaced by a deep, aching vulnerability that stole Elian's breath. "I call it," Kyle said, his voice barely audible, raw and fractured. "Damage control." The words were a slap, a dismissal, and yet his eyes told a different story. They told a story of fear, of a desperate, paradoxical need to keep Elian both close and at a distance, safe and untouched. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was something Kale was terrified of breaking, or perhaps something he was terrified of breaking him. The air between them thrummed, a live wire of unspoken confessions and primal instincts. Kale had shown his hand, and now neither of them could pretend the game was the same. The aftermath of the confrontation with Yorick was a profound, ringing silence. No official reprimand came for Kale. His influence was too great, his report on Yorick's instability too clinically perfect to be questioned. But the event had changed the atmosphere between them. Kyle's control was still present, but it was now laced with a visible tension, the restraint of a man holding back a force he barely contained. He no longer just watched Elian from his office. He found reasons to be on the archive floor, examining artifacts near Elian's station. His presence a constant, silent hum of energy that made the fine hairs on Elian's arms stand up. The possessive scent from that day lingered on Elian for nearly 48 hours, a ghostly brand that made betas avert their eyes and the few other alphas in the facility give him a wide berth. He felt marked, claimed in a way that had no name or official status, a paradox of the highest order. This proximity began to fray the edges of Elian's own control. His suppressant dosage, which had kept his Omega nature dormant for years, began to feel insufficient. He started experiencing moments of sensory bleed-through. The scent of an aging manuscript would suddenly become overwhelmingly vivid, filling his head with the ghost of ancient forests. The low hum of the climate controls would occasionally spike into a painful, high-pitched whine only he could hear. And worst of all were the flashes of heat, like a fever breaking for only a second, a sudden, searing warmth that started deep in his belly and left him breathless and trembling. His body was waking up, nudged from its chemical slumber by the constant, potent presence of the Alpha who refused to claim him. One evening, long after the other archivists had left, Elian was working on a particularly delicate artifact, a small, leather-bound journal. The ink was faded, the paper fragile. As he carefully turned a page, his glove caught, tearing a tiny corner. A jolt of panic went through him. Such damage, however small, had to be reported. He looked up toward the glass office, but Kyle was not there. A moment later, he heard a soft footstep behind him. A pre-consortium diary? Kyle's voice was low, directly behind him. Elian hadn't even heard him approach. Elian stiffened, not turning around. "Yes, Director. The script is difficult to decipher. Let me see." It was not a request. Kyle moved to stand beside him, his hip almost brushing Elian's arm. He leaned over the console, his head bent close to Elian's, to examine the journal. The scent of ozone and steel was clean, sharp, but Elian's newly awakened senses could detect the faint, dark undertones of the storm, always simmering just beneath the surface. The warmth from Kale's body was a tangible presence, seeping into Elian's side, making his own skin prickle with a strange, forbidden heat. Kale pointed a gloved finger at a passage. The script is a variant of cursive, common in the final decades before unification. This phrase here. He paused, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. The heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing. The words hung in the air between them, a piece of ancient outlawed sentiment. The heart, a messy, inefficient organ that the consortium had tried to regulate into obsolescence. Elian stared at the faded ink, the phrase echoing in his mind. It was a perfect encapsulation of the man standing beside him. An illogical statement, Elian said, his voice tight. Emotion as a justification for action is a primary source of societal instability. He was quoting directly from the consortium's founding charter. He felt Cale's gaze shift from the book to him. And yet, they wrote it down, Cale murmured. They carved it into history, as if it was a truth they were terrified of forgetting. The intensity of the moment was suffocating. Elian's pulse hammered in his ears. He had to break the spell. He gestured to the minuscule tear in the page. I have to log the damage. I was careless. Cale looked at the tear, then back at Elian's face. His expression was unreadable in the dim light of the archives. No, he said softly. You won't. Some imperfections are not meant to be recorded. He reached out, and for the first time, he initiated contact. His fingers, still sheathed in their black glove, gently brushed against Elian's hand, where it rested on the console. The touch was brief, a ghost of pressure, but it sent a bolt of lightning through Elian's entire system. A wave of heat, stronger than any before, washed through him, making him gasp. Kyle withdrew his hand, as if burned, his own body going rigid. He had felt it. The jolt of connection, the sudden spike in Elian's pheromones that even the suppressants couldn't contain. The air crackled, thick with unspoken biology. Elian's scent, the earthy fragrance of rain and old paper, bloomed for a moment, sharp and sweet, with a desperate, questioning note of need. Cale took a step back, the mask of the director slamming back into place, but his eyes were wide, a flicker of something close to panic in their grey depths. Your biometrics are fluctuating, he said, his voice strained, clinical. You should increase your suppressant dosage by 5%. I will authorize it. He turned and walked back to his office without another word. His movements stiff and precise. Elian was left trembling, his hand tingling where Cale had touched it. He stared at the journal, at the words about the heart's reasons, and felt a profound, aching despair. Cale's solution to the fire he himself had stoked was to command Elian to pour more water on it, to numb himself further, to push the awakening Omega back into its chemical prison. That night, in the solitude of his sterile apartment, Elian disobeyed. He held a small white suppressant pill in his palm, and instead of taking it, he flushed it down the waste disposal unit. It was a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration of war. If Carl was going to keep him in this cage of undefined possession, he would not do it as a ghost. He would be real. He would feel. He didn't know what he was unleashing, but for the first time, the fear of the unknown was less terrifying than the certainty of a numb, controlled existence. He was choosing to feel, even if it meant he might break. The decision to skip his suppressant dose was like opening a floodgate. The next day, the world assaulted Elian's senses. The archives were no longer a place of quiet contemplation. They were a cacophony of scent and sound. He could smell the lingering perfume of a beta archivist from 2 corridors away, the tang of ozone from a sparking light fixture, the subtle variations in the decay of each and every manuscript. The low hum of the building was a symphony of distinct vibrations, each with its own pitch and rhythm. It was overwhelming, a sensory deluge that left him dizzy and disoriented. He tried to focus on his work, but his body was a stranger to him. A constant, low-level thrum of energy pulsed just beneath his skin. When Kale arrived and settled into his glass-walled office, his presence was like a magnetic pole, pulling at every atom of Elian's being. His scent, even from that distance, was a clear, sharp beacon in the sensory chaos, and Elian found himself breathing it in, his body craving it with a desperate, primal instinct he could no longer deny. He felt exposed, his newly awakened Omega nature raw and vulnerable. His search for answers, for context to Kyle's behavior, became more desperate. He began using his archival clearance to delve into the Directorate's private records, searching for anything on Kale that wasn't part of his public, perfectly curated profile. It was a huge risk. His every keystroke was logged. But he masked his search, burying it under layers of legitimate-looking queries about historical security protocols. Late one night, after Kyle had finally departed, Elian found it. A sealed file, classified under a defunct project code from 2 decades prior. Project Chimera. His clearance shouldn't have been high enough, but a glitch in the system, a ghost of older protocols, allowed him access. The file opened, and the clinical, detached world of the consortium dissolved into a story of raw, human tragedy. It was a series of medical and psychological reports on a young Omega named Lyra. Her profile picture showed a vibrant, smiling face, full of a light that Elian had never seen in anyone within the Enclave. She was listed as a high-potential Omega, but her emotional responses were deemed excessively volatile. She was paired with a promising young Alpha Enforcer. The file contained surveillance footage, short, silent clips of the two of them. The Alpha was young, his features less severe, but his eyes were the same pale, winter sky grey. It was Kyle, a Kyle that Elian had never imagined, one who smiled, who touched Lyra's arm with an easy tenderness, whose entire posture bespoke a deep, unguarded affection. The reports grew darker. Lyra had struggled with the suppressants, with the emotional sterility of the consortium. She had been prone to fits of melancholy and bouts of unsanctioned exuberance. They called her unstable. They called her a risk. The final report detailed the incident. Lyra had suffered a complete psychological breakdown during a public ceremony, a display of raw, uncontrolled emotion that the Council could not tolerate. The solution was reconditioning, a clinical term for a process that stripped away personality, emotion, and memory, leaving behind a docile, compliant shell. Project Chimera had been the experimental program for this procedure. Lyra was its first and only subject. The final entry was a single, clinical sentence. Subject Lyra successfully reconditioned and reassigned to a low-level domestic unit. Alpha Kale transferred to Directorate training, recommended for roles requiring high levels of emotional detachment and strategic control. Elian stared at the screen, a cold sickness spreading through him. He saw it all now. The control, the obsession with stability, the fear of emotion. Kale wasn't a monster. He was a survivor. He had loved someone, and the system he now commanded had taken her, dissected her soul, and handed him back an empty vessel. His rejection of relationships was not a philosophy. It was a scar, a vow made in the face of unbearable loss. He believed emotional bonds were a weakness the system would exploit and destroy. His control over Elian wasn't about possession in the way Yorick had intended. It was a desperate, twisted form of protection. By keeping Elian isolated, untouched and emotionally neutral, he was trying to prevent history from repeating itself. He was trying to keep Elian from becoming another Lyra. The knowledge was a devastating weight. It did not excuse Kael's actions, but it cast them in a new, tragic light. He was both jailer and protector, his cage built from the bars of his own trauma. As Elian sat there in the silent archives, the truth of his situation settled upon him. He was in love with a man who was terrified of love itself, a man who would rather build a fortress around him than ever risk opening the door. At that moment, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The sensory overload of the day, combined with the emotional shock of the revelation, was too much. A sharp, cramping pain seized his abdomen, and a wave of intense, dry heat flooded his body. It was not the fleeting warmth of before. This was a tidal wave, a furnace igniting in his core. The scent of rain and old paper, his own scent, erupted from him, no longer subtle, but thick and sweet with distress, a desperate biological scream for help. The suppressants hadn't just been failing. They had masked an oncoming heat, one that his body, now free of their chemical shackles, was embracing with a vengeance. The alarms on his biomonitor, built into his chair, began to flash red. A silent alert, sent directly to the Directorate's medical and security divisions. They would be here in minutes. They would sedate him, reset him, put him back in the chemical cage. And Kael, in his desperate attempt to protect him, would have inadvertently led the system right to his door. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth as another wave of heat crashed over him, pulling him down into a hazy, feverish darkness. The world dissolved into a blur of overlapping sensations. The sharp, insistent flashing of the red alert light on his console pulsed against his eyelids. The low hum of the archives pitched into a high, keening whine that vibrated deep in his teeth. The air, once a comfort of old paper and dust, was now thick and suffocating, choked with the scent of his own distress, a sweet, desperate perfume that clung to every surface. Each wave of heat was more intense than the last, a fire licking up his spine, coiling in his gut. His thoughts fragmented, the clinical precision he had cultivated for years shattering into pieces of raw, primal need. Alpha, safe, help. The words were not his own. They were an ancient script bubbling up from his very DNA. He heard the distant sound of the archive's main doors sliding open, the sharp, authoritative clicks of boots on the polished floor. Not the soft-soled shoes of the beta archivists. These were security, medical. They were coming to correct the anomaly, to fix him. A surge of pure animal terror shot through him, powerful enough to cut through the feverish haze. He tried to stand, to run, but his limbs were heavy, uncoordinated. He slumped against his console, a choked sob escaping his lips, then a different sound. One set of boots, moving faster than the others, with a purpose that was not clinical, but urgent. A presence cut through the chaos, a familiar pressure change in the air, a scent of ozone and steel sliced through the thick sweetness of his own fear. Kael. He appeared at the end of the aisle, a stark figure in black against the glowing data stacks. He wasn't walking. He was moving with the lethal grace of a predator. His eyes found Elian's, and in that instant, the world seemed to slow. The director's mask was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded expression of sheer panic, something that mirrored Elian's own terror. He saw the flashing light, the distress pheromones thick in the air, and he understood. The other footsteps were closer now, rounding the far corner. Kyle didn't hesitate. He crossed the remaining distance in 3 long strides, his hand shooting out to slam a red button on the wall. The emergency containment lockdown meant for catastrophic data breaches or fires. A heavy metallic shutter slammed down over the main entrance with a deafening clang, sealing them inside. Another followed, blocking the secondary exit. They were trapped. Together. "Director, what are you doing?" Elian gasped, his voice thin and reedy. Kyle ignored him, his focus absolute. He moved to Elian's console, his fingers flying across the keypad, overriding the alert, severing the connection to the central security grid. The flashing red light died, plunging the aisle into the dim, ambient glow of the data stacks. The silence that followed the clang of the shutters was immense, profound. "They will sedate you," Kyle said, his voice a low, rough growl. He finally turned to face Elian fully. The scent of his own tightly controlled panic was a sharp, acrid note under the ozone. "They will recalibrate your system. It can cause neurological damage." He didn't say Lyra's name, but it hung between them, a ghost in the enclosed space. Another wave of heat crashed over Elian, stronger this time, and he cried out, folding in on himself. The pain was sharp, but underneath it was a deep, aching emptiness, a biological imperative for a presence, a touch, a scent to anchor him. His eyes, hazy with fever, fixed on Kale. His Omega instincts, now completely unbound, saw not a director, not a jailer, but an alpha, the only alpha, the one whose scent was a promise of safety, however twisted. Kale saw the look in his eyes, the shift from lucid fear to heat-driven instinct. He took a half-step back, his own control fracturing. "Elian," he said, his voice tight with strain, "you have to fight it. It's a chemical reaction, nothing more." "It hurts," Elian whispered, the words torn from him. He reached a trembling hand out, not to Kale, but to the space between them, a desperate, pleading gesture. Kale's scent filled the small space, the storm within him raging. The sterile ozone was gone, replaced entirely by the dark, possessive thunder, now laced with a sharp, frantic edge of fear. He was terrified, not of Elian, but of himself, of the instinct that Elian's raw vulnerability was screaming at, demanding a response, to claim, to protect, to soothe, everything he had spent 20 years suppressing. "I don't do this," he bit out, the words more for himself than for Elian. He was backing away, retreating down the aisle as if Elian were the source of a contagion. "I don't do relationships. I don't do bonds. They are a weakness." The rejection, even in his fevered state, was a physical blow. A low, wounded sound escaped Elian's throat. His body, in its desperate state, interpreted the retreat as abandonment. The pain intensified, a sharp, twisting agony. "Please," he begged, not even knowing what he was asking for. "Don't leave." Kale stopped. He stood at the end of the aisle, silhouetted against the glowing shelves, his entire body rigid with conflict. He was a man caught between his traumatized past and his instinctual present. To stay was to break every rule he had ever lived by. To leave Elian to suffer alone was to commit a cruelty he couldn't stomach. The sounds of fists pounding on the containment shutter echoed from the main entrance, a dull, rhythmic beat that underscored the tension. They had very little time. Slowly, as if moving against a powerful current, Kale turned. He walked back toward Elian, each step a deliberate, agonizing decision. He stopped just out of reach, his face a mask of torment. His grey eyes were dark, swirling with a storm of emotions Elian had never seen. "This is not a bond," Kyle said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "This is not a relationship. This is containment, a temporary solution to a biological crisis." He was trying to rationalize it, to frame it in the clinical language he understood. But his scent told a different story. It was a maelstrom of possession, of fear, of a desperate, unwilling tenderness. He knelt before Elian, who was now slumped against the base of the console. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached out and, with an infinite trembling slowness, he laid his hand on Elian's forehead. The contact was electric. Kyle's skin was cool, a stark contrast to Elian's feverish heat. The simple, non-threatening touch was an anchor in the storm of Elian's senses. A wave of relief, so profound it was painful, washed through him. His body, starved for any form of soothing contact, shuddered violently. Kale's scent, no longer a weapon or a warning, began to change. The harsh edges softened, the possessive thunder gentling into a low, protective rumble. He was instinctively releasing calming pheromones, a biological response he was likely not even aware of. "It will pass," Kale murmured, his voice strained. "We just have to wait it out." But Elian, his instincts now overriding all else, knew that wasn't enough. The ache in his core was a physical void that only one thing could fill. He leaned into Kale's touch, a small, desperate movement, and his own scent pulsed, a silent, fragrant plea. Closer. Kale's control finally, irrevocably, shattered. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, frustrated instinct. He moved, pulling Elian away from the hard console and into his lap, cradling him against his chest. The embrace was not gentle. It was fierce, desperate, the action of a drowning man clinging to a raft. He buried his face in the crook of Elian's neck, right over his scent gland, and inhaled deeply. Elian arched into him, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief breaking from his lips. The storm had found its center. The world narrowed to this single point of contact, to the feeling of Kale's strong arms around him, the sound of his ragged breathing, and the overwhelming, protective, all-encompassing scent of the alpha, who had finally, in every way that mattered, come home. The pounding on the door faded into a distant, irrelevant noise. The universe was here, in the dark, silent aisle, in the arms of his sworn protector and his unwitting captor. The hours that followed were a timeless, feverish haze. Elian drifted in and out of lucidity, anchored only by Kale's solid presence. The director, the alpha, held him, a constant, unwavering point of contact in the swirling chaos of the heat. He didn't speak. Words were insufficient, tainted by the clinical world they had left outside the sealed doors. Instead, he communicated through scent and touch. His pheromones were a steady, calming blanket, a low, rumbling reassurance that soothed the sharpest edges of Elian's pain and panic. When a particularly violent wave of cramping seized Elian, Kale's arms would tighten, his hand pressing firmly against the small of Elian's back, a solid, grounding pressure, until the spasm passed. In his moments of clarity, Elian would study the man holding him. Kale's face, illuminated by the soft glow of the data stacks, was stripped of all its usual defenses. The severe lines were softened by exhaustion. The cold steel of his eyes melted into a liquid grey of profound concern and a deep, weary sadness. He looked at Elian not as a subject or an asset, but as something precious and fragile that he was terrified of breaking. Elian saw the ghost of the young Alpha from the surveillance files, the one who had loved an Omega named Lyra. The trauma was still there, etched into the faint lines around his eyes. But for the first time, it was not the only thing Elian could see. He saw the man underneath the scar tissue. At one point, Elian's throat was parched, a dry, rasping ache. He made a small, distressed sound, and Kale shifted immediately. He eased Elian down to rest against a row of decommissioned server casings and disappeared into the gloom. He returned a moment later with a small, sealed bottle of purified water from an emergency kit. He opened it and held it to Elian's lips, tilting it gently, his movements careful and patient. Elian drank, his eyes never leaving Kyle's face. The simple act of care was more intimate than any touch, a quiet testament to the shift that was occurring between them. This was not containment. This was devotion. As the peak of the heat began to subside, the raw biological need gave way to a profound, aching vulnerability. The fever broke, leaving Elian drenched in sweat, weak but clear-headed. He was still nestled in Kale's arms, his head resting on the Alpha's shoulder. The silence in the archives was no longer tense. It was soft, contemplative. The rhythmic pounding on the containment door had long since stopped. Security would be waiting, maintaining a perimeter, their orders likely confused and contradictory without the director to guide them. Kale, Elian whispered, his voice hoarse. It was the first time he had used the Alpha's name without his title. Kale stiffened slightly, then relaxed. He pulled back just enough to look at Elian's face. "The worst is over," he said, his own voice rough with fatigue. "I saw her file," Elian confessed, the words quiet but heavy with meaning. "Lyra." Kyle's face closed off, the familiar mask of control attempting to reassert itself, but he was too exhausted to maintain it. The pain was there, stark and undisguised in his eyes. He looked away, staring into the darkness of the aisle. "Then you understand," he said, his voice flat. "You understand why this cannot happen." "Understand what?" Elian pushed, his newfound clarity giving him strength. "That you're going to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for something the system did. That you'll lock me away to protect me from a life you're too afraid to let me live. I am protecting you from being broken." Kyle's voice cracked, a fissure in his iron composure. He looked back at Elian, his eyes blazing with a desperate, frustrated anguish. "They took her. They hollowed her out. Because she felt too much, because our bond made her a liability. I will not let that happen to you. I will not watch them do that to you." "So you'll do it yourself?" Elian countered, his voice gaining an edge of steel. "You'll keep me numb and isolated and alone. You'll keep me in a sterile cage and call it safety. That's not protection, Kyle. It's a prison. It's just a slower, quieter way of being broken." The truth of his words struck Kyle with the force of a physical blow. He flinched, his gaze falling. He looked down at his own hands, then at Elian, cradled in his arms. He had locked down the archives to keep the system out, but in doing so, he had created an echo of his own deepest fear. A cage, with Elian trapped inside with him. The irony was devastating. For 20 years, he had wielded control as his shield and his sword. Now he saw that it was just another wall, one that had imprisoned him just as much as it had protected him. "I don't know any other way," Kale admitted, the confession a raw, ragged whisper. It was the most honest thing Elian had ever heard him say. "Then learn," Elian said softly. He reached up, his hand trembling slightly, and touched Kyle's cheek. The skin was rough with stubble, real and human. "Learn with me." Kyle closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down his temple. It was a tear for Lyra, for the young alpha he had been, and for the profound, terrifying hope that was beginning to dawn in the wreckage of his carefully constructed world. He stayed like that for a long moment, simply breathing, before he opened his eyes again. The storm in them had not vanished, but it had calmed. The lashing winds had given way to a deep, churning sea of uncertainty and a fragile, nascent resolve. He looked at the containment door, then back at Elian. "They will not stop," he said, his voice regaining some of its strategic crispness. "When I open that door, they will take you. They will report my actions. I will be stripped of my position, and a new director will ensure you are managed correctly." A cold dread washed over Elian. The brief sanctuary they had found was about to be obliterated. Then what do we do? Kale's gaze sharpened. The mind that had orchestrated the flawless dismissal of a dozen alpha candidates, the mind that knew every protocol and every loophole of the system he commanded, began to work. "The consortium believes this building is a sealed fortress," he said, a new, dangerous energy in his voice. "But it is old. It was built on the foundations of the city that came before." He looked down a long, dark service corridor that branched off from the main aisle. "There are ways out, forgotten ways, tunnels that lead beyond the Enclave's perimeter wall." It was an insane idea. To flee the Enclave was to choose a death sentence. The outside wastes were supposedly toxic, lawless, uninhabitable. "There is nothing out there," Elian whispered, echoing the propaganda they had been fed since birth. "Isn't there?" Kyle countered. He gestured vaguely in the direction of the quarantined sub-level. "Where did the paintings come from? The journals? The artifacts you spend your days with? They came from nothing, from settlements of people who chose to live, not just exist." He looked at Elian, his expression deadly serious. "It will be dangerous. It will be uncertain. We would have nothing." Elian looked at the man before him, the man who had hoarded him, protected him, and finally broken down for him. He thought of the sterile apartment, the endless assessments, the chemical numbness. That was nothing. Here, in the ruins of their old lives, was the beginning of something. "We would have each other," Elian said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. A slow, sad, beautiful smile touched Kale's lips for the very first time. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows of the past. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not bother to name. "We would." He stood, pulling Elian gently to his feet. Elian was weak, his legs unsteady, but Kale supported him, his arm a solid band around his waist. Together, they turned away from the sealed door and the world it represented. They faced the darkness of the service corridor, the unknown future. It was a choice between a gilded cage and a dangerous, terrifying freedom. And for the first time, it felt like no choice at all. The escape was a descent into the city's forgotten history. Kale, using the master override codes he had memorized years ago, unlocked a heavy service hatch hidden behind a decommissioned server rack. It opened onto a spiral staircase, its metal steps coated in a fine layer of dust, descending into absolute blackness. The air that rose to meet them was cool and damp, carrying the alien scent of wet stone and decay. It was the first truly natural smell Elian had ever encountered, and it was both unnerving and exhilarating. "The old maintenance tunnels," Kale explained, his voice a low echo in the narrow stairwell. He activated a small light on his wristcom, casting a moving circle of illumination that danced over the corroded walls. "They connect to the original city's aqueduct system. Most of them were sealed off, but the schematics are still in the deep archives, if you know where to look." Of course he knew. Kyle knew everything about the bones of the city he ruled. They moved slowly, Elian leaning heavily on Kale, his body still weak from the heat. Every step down was a step away from the sterile, controlled world above. The humming of the enclave faded, replaced by the drip of water and the scuttling of unseen things in the darkness. It should have been terrifying, but with Kale's solid presence beside him, Elian felt a strange sense of peace. The claustrophobia of the enclave was a pressure on the soul. This was merely physical confinement, and it felt infinitely more honest. They walked for what felt like hours through a labyrinth of tunnels. Some were narrow maintenance shafts, forcing them to move in single file. Others opened into vast, cavernous spaces where the remnants of the old world lay sleeping. They passed skeletal remains of ancient transport vehicles, rusted and covered in moss. Elian saw faded advertisements painted on the tunnel walls, their promises of happiness and consumption rendered meaningless by time. It was his archive come to life, a history that was not catalogued and sanitized, but simply left to be. Kale was quiet, focused, navigating the maze with an unerring sense of direction. But Elian could sense the tension in him, the constant, low-level alertness of a soldier in enemy territory. He had shed the skin of the director and reverted to the enforcer he had once been. Yet his treatment of Elian remained gentle, his hand never far from his back, his pace always matched to Elian's own weary steps. They stopped to rest in a dry, secluded alcove. Kale produced 2 nutrient bars from a pocket in his uniform. They were tasteless, functional, a remnant of the world they'd left behind. As they ate in silence, Elian studied Kyle in the dim glow of the comlight. The weight of his past actions seemed to be settling on him. "You're giving up everything," Elian said quietly. "Your power, your position, everything you built." Kale finished his bar and carefully sealed the wrapper, a creature of habit even here. He didn't look at Elian. "I built a prison," he corrected, his voice flat. "For myself, as much as for anyone else. I called it order. I called it stability. I spent 20 years reinforcing its walls. The irony is, the only thing of value was already inside it with me." He finally met Elian's gaze, his grey eyes clear and direct in the darkness. And I was too blind to see it. The simple, unadorned confession was more powerful than any poetic declaration. It was a truth stripped bare. Elian felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the lingering effects of his heat. He reached out, his fingers finding Kale's in the dark. Kale's hand closed around his grip firm, a silent, binding promise. They continued their journey, and eventually the air began to change again. The damp subterranean smell was gradually replaced by a new scent, one Elian had only read about in his books. It was the smell of wet earth, of living, growing things. A faint grey light began to filter through cracks in the tunnel ceiling. "We're close," Kale said, his voice low. "The tunnel terminates at an old storm drain, beyond the outer perimeter fence. The final stretch was a crawl through a narrow circular pipe. At the end was a heavy iron grate, its bars thick with rust. Kale put his shoulder to it, grunting with effort. With a screech of tortured metal, the grate gave way, swinging outward into a curtain of thick green foliage. Kale went first, pushing aside leaves and branches, then turned and helped Elian through. Elian emerged, blinking, into a world of overwhelming sensation. It was drizzling, a soft, persistent rain that was nothing like the sanitized water of the enclave's atmospheric regulators. He tilted his face up, letting the cool droplets run down his cheeks. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked soil, decaying leaves, and the sweet perfume of some unseen white flower. The world was not white and grey and black. It was 1,000 shades of green and brown, muted by the overcast sky. The silence was not the humming, manufactured stillness of the consortium. It was a living quiet, filled with the rustle of leaves, the patter of rain, and the distant call of a bird. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was gloriously, breathtakingly alive. He turned to Kale, who was watching him with a soft, unguarded expression. The rain darkened his black uniform, plastering his hair to his forehead. He looked less like a director and more like a man who had just come through a long and brutal war. Elian saw the uncertainty in his eyes, the fear of this vast, untamed world. Elian stepped toward him, closing the small distance between them. He raised a hand and brushed a wet strand of hair from Kyle's forehead. The gesture was simple, tender. Kyle's breath hitched. "I told you I don't do relationships," Kyle whispered, the words a ghost of his former self, a final, reflexive defense against the emotion that was welling up inside him. Elian smiled, a true, radiant smile that felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. "I know," he said softly. He leaned in and pressed his lips to Kale's. The kiss was not passionate or desperate. It was quiet, gentle, a confirmation. It tasted of rain and freedom. Kyle's hands came up to cup Elian's face, his touch no longer hesitant or possessive, but filled with a reverence that made Elian's heart ache. They broke the kiss and simply stood there for a long moment, foreheads resting together, breathing in the scent of the rain and each other. They were fugitives, with no plan and no destination. The future was a vast, unknown territory. But they were free, free from the system, free from the past, and finally, free to be with each other. The cage was gone, and in its place, the entire world had just begun.